Hey guys, week 2, George is back. Um, so let's jump right in with some terms and concepts for this week's lesson. Um, social vulnerability was a big one, which it just describes groups of people by their personal descriptors, so age, race, health, where they live, what kind of jobs they have, how much money they make, um, what their communities look like, if they're disabled. Um, and then I mentioned that those things oftentimes go hand in hand with or are the product of social inequalities. So um, people that live in highly um, populated areas and make less money, they oftentimes have less access to resources, information, technology. They have limited political sway, if any, and maybe some conservative beliefs or physical limitations. So that makes them pretty vulnerable to these disasters when they happen. That same article had the Social Vulnerability Index, which was the relative measure of overall social vulnerability for each county. And those tables were really interesting, but a little bit confusing for me anyway to make a lot of sense out of. It seemed like some good information. Other important concepts for this week were physically disabled. So obviously any physically disabled person is going to have more difficulty getting out of an area if there's a disaster. So we have to put programs in place for that. I thought it was interesting that they mentioned the state and local funding programs that ensure the accessibility of public schools were relevant in discussion of funding and just the management of physically disabled people, because a lot of times they've used the public's money and tax dollars to make their buildings better, and then those schools are used as housing areas for the general community when a natural disaster occurs. So they need to make sure that they are accessible to the physically disabled. Lots of stuff about the physically disabled. Lower income, more likely to live alone, less likely to have health insurance, just overall way more susceptible to having really negative impacts from disasters. So then along those lines, women are also more likely to not die in disasters, but more likely to live in poverty. And so they have some hurdles to overcome in disasters as well. But the article that discussed the differences in gender did mention that men are more likely to die in a disaster, which isn't totally shocking. Men are typically the ones that are going out and fixing power lines and are on the front lines of emergency management, not all the time, but just they're more likely to be out there doing the jobs that are going to put them in harm's way versus being at home taking care of people. So I thought that was interesting as well. And then the one article had lots of terms like CAO, Chief Administrative Officer, MOA, Memoranda of Agreement, LEMC is Local Emergency Management Committees, just some terms that they kept using, and I had to keep reminding myself what they meant. Let's see. So move on to what was your muddiest point. Like I said, those charts were really confusing. As a graphic design major, I thought that was one point in this, the emergency management stuff, where I could have a job, kind of making the information, like so much of this is super valuable information, and just making it more easily understandable and accessible to people that really need it. And then hopefully that influences people to be prepared for disasters a little bit better also, just by making the information more visually pleasing and easy to understand. And then the social vulnerability and environmental hazards article was really interesting and really complex. So I think that I could take a second look at that, especially considering my analysis essay topic. I think that would offer some good information that I need to dig a little bit deeper for. Lastly, the question for the week, I would say, how do you think that we could take the socially vulnerable communities and incentivize disaster preparedness and planning? So, for example, they were talking about how socially vulnerable communities that frequently experience disasters are better at managing them and at evacuating, at recovering, even if they don't have the funds to do all of those things. They have the experience and the knowledge. Can we take the knowledge of those people in the socially vulnerable communities and give them some jobs that would maybe train people in highly populated areas, big cities like Houston, for example, so that you have more members of the community that really understand how to be prepared for disasters and what we can do to just get the community together and understanding the risks and how to make life a little bit easier. So that's it for this week. And will Georgia come back? Georgia, come back. Georgia and I hope you have a good rest of your week.